Hi, good morning, everybody. What we'll do is that we'll start off just 1 minute past the hour. So if you want to post your questions in the meantime there, please do so in the chat. And you can do that anonymously to our panelists. We'll mark an Adrian. Alternatively, you can post it as a question, which is denoted by the two speech bubbles in your toolbar there. Right, crack on, Gromit. Welcome to this Elephants Don't Forget webinar, where we make compliance and regulatory issues as popular as Labubu dolls. You know, it's where it's at. I'm telling you, this is where it's at. Record numbers yet again decide to populate this webinar channel, and we're delighted that. You know what? On retrospect, I think I should edit that one out. Um, who wrote this script? I don't know. But today's webinar is part of our ongoing support to help firms not only comply with regulatory outputs, but also adherence to the consumer duty, but also embed its way that it delivers lasting values to your customers, to your clients, as well as to your firms. And today's exam question we hope to answer is simply this. How can your firm meaningfully test whether it's delivering good outcomes? And what does effective measurement and continuous improvement really look like in practice? Thankfully, help is at hand in our erstwhile panel members here, Mark Ireland, Will Murphy of regulatory advisory firm Avyse Partners, as well as chairman and co-founder of Elephants Don't Forget, Adrian Harvey there. As ever, you can post your questions to us. You don't have to agree with everything we say on this webinar, and you can actually rewind this at your leisure. That's an old word, isn't it? Rewind, but at your leisure by making sure that when we send you a copy of this webinar straight after this session has ended, alongside a PDF version of the slide deck here. And so what we're going to discuss are 4 key areas, but if there are other areas that you want us to pick up, panelists have agreed that I'll take that offline and cover those off. Designing outcome testing framework. How can your MI drive support and present better outcome testing? Designing MI that really truly captures outcomes monitoring effectively and efficiently, and why firms are moving away from a tick box approach to training to improve customer outcomes. If that is of interest to you, which I hope it is, then you're in the right place today. So let's get cracking on with our first poll question. As ever, this is an interactive session. We'd love to hear your feedback and to make sure that we are going in the direction of travel that you want us to do to ensure that you get a good outcome from this webinar. So our first question is, what changes have you made to your monitoring routines since the launch of the duty? So what changes have you made to your monitoring routines since the launch of the duty? Now, you can put no changes, limited changes, moderate changes, or comprehensive changes there. We've given you some indications of what that could look like there. But kick us off, Mark, if you would do there, because the regulator's been pretty consistent about what they expect on this topic.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair to say, Philip, and we'll go into a little bit more detail around precisely what's been done and when in a few slides' time. But whenever I talk to firms on this particular topic, I like to reel off a quote that the FCA gave actually following a look at looking at outcomes monitoring at some of the larger insurers. And when they published the findings and suggested improvements and areas from enhancement within that report, They basically said that under the Consumer Duty, firms must regularly assess, test, understand, and evidence that the outcomes that their customers are receiving. And they were quite bold and said, without this, it will be impossible for firms to know that they're meeting the requirements set out in the duty. Now, that's quite a blunt statement and should leave firms in no doubt that outcome testing is absolutely imperative.
Mm. And when we see the poll results, thank you very much for sharing. Well, the lead answer is moderate changes, 49%, followed by limited changes, 26, 2% not at all. Where does that surprise you, Will?
I mean, it's good to see that we've got a lot of confidence in the audience who have made moderate and comprehensive changes. I think from our perspective, we've seen a real mixed bag of firms from, moderate, comprehensive changes. So I think some of the more agile and larger firms have established, full teams of outcome testers and have got dedicated resource in first and second line. But, the more limited or changes, we've seen firms not quite grasp understanding and maybe just do something along the lines of repurpose and reshape their current QA model, which is basically just looking still at a single contact point with a customer, a single conversation, and they're still falling short and actually just making a judgment as to the conduct of the agent on that telephone call, for example, or looking at adherence to process rather than actually looking at an outcome and looking at a wider journey. So a real mixed bag.
I guess it all comes down to, Adrian, what changes you're making and why you're making them and how you're making them.
Indeed. Regular attendees will know I haven't been on the last couple of webinars, and I've left other members of the herd to step up to the plate. But apparently we've got some feedback. I'm back with some more controversial views as to how things are going. So do I think, yes, it's what changes. And I think I am obviously going to be talking about changes relative to employees and the role and duty that employers have to ensure their employees have the competence and support to enjoy their job and excel at it.
When we actually look at the second question here, we are looking at how confident are you that you have the appropriate data and MI available to meeting your ongoing consumer duty obligations. So how confident are you that you have the appropriate data? So on a Likert scale of not at all confident right through to extremely confident, you shouldn't even be asking me this question, Philip. Where do you stand on this? And Adrian, are firms doing enough to improve the competency of their staff?
Right, so my Billy basic point is you cannot achieve consistently good customer outcomes without consistently competent enrolled employees. It's just a basic truth. Against that backdrop, I have to ask the question, how many people on the webinar have even a vague handle on the actual competence of their individual employees? When I ask C-suite leaders, they generally use words like, yeah, pretty good, yeah, solid, yeah, we're okay, and things like that. Well, that's the most imprecise measure criteria scale. If you apply a scale out of 100, and I can tell you from more than 200 million interventions over the last 13 years, the average level of competence is 54%. So if you're atypical, and I have no reason to believe most of the firms on this webinar are not, then your employees are likely to be something like 54% average competence across that group. If that's true, the likelihood of you delivering consistently good customer outcomes is 0. And most of you don't even measure it. So I like the phrase that somebody reminded, it might have been me, you, Philip, throwing you under the bus. What was it? What was the phrase? It was human judgment and the role that human judgment plays in good customer outcomes. We should not underestimate even the frictionless digital providers on the webinar today. Humans play a huge role in getting that good outcome, and they can't achieve that if they're not competent. And right now, you don't know how competent they are or not. I told you.
I do wonder, Philip, if in future webinars we should have a specific poll on, the proportion of attendees that dial in to hear some genuine regulatory insights or competence and capability insights versus those that dial in to hear Adrian's, in his own words, controversial views. That would be an interesting question to ask.
Just point him in the right direction as long as we dial him, wind him up, and he's like walks like this into the storm there. But it's probably a reason why, one of the indicators why that 40% or 46% of the audience is somewhat confident, in their outcomes approach to ongoing consumer duty obligations, though, Mark, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, there's no surprise, no surprise in that poll at all. Every business has a different starting position in terms of their MI and and indeed their outcome testing. And if we look at what the FCA's focusing on now from a consumer duty perspective, last year was primarily in and around the implementation activities. Now it's focused on the oversight activities, so the outcome testing in MI. There's no surprise in that, because invariably you sort of need to build your processes, you sort of need to build your controls before you can start outcome testing those, before you can start getting an MI off the back of them. So it's no surprise that for lots of businesses, the MI, there's been some progress made, but it remains work in progress. And FCA have said this is a journey. Maybe there isn't an actual end destination to it, but it's certainly a journey. So the poll doesn't present any surprises from my perspective.
So Will, clear this up for us there. Forward to basics on this one there. What is outcomes testing and what isn't it?
I think there's a lot of different is and isn'ts on that slide there, just to hone in on a couple. I think number 10 is always, as someone who's worked in second line quite a lot, I think number 10 rings true, and that's ownership. I think because you've got the terms monitoring and testing, I think a lot of firms who don't quite get it right still fall short and think there's a bit of an over-reliance on second line to do this testing and push it to second line and say, well, second line's testing our outcomes. But, in reality, it's not about assigning a RAG rating to something. It's about identifying where you've got opportunities to improve your products and improve your customer outcomes. And really that heavily involves first line's input. So that's where I see it going wrong quite a lot. It's something that needs to be done across first, second, and even third line as well on some occasions. And then another one is that around this end-to-end process I mentioned before on the QA side of things, focusing on one customer interaction. Outcome monitoring and testing is not about looking at one interaction. You need to look at the whole journey of that customer, and you're not rating someone's performance on a call. You need to consider, what information and data are you looking at, marketing, distribution, customer services, complaints. So that's what monitoring is. It's understand what your outcomes are at those points in time, and then deciding what you need, what data points and touch points you need information on to form a view as to whether you're performing against that outcome or not.
I mean, I think, I think that there's nothing wrong with transactional testing. As long as it's targeted at tangible activities that that do in fact take place. We spend a lot of time looking at QA and call monitoring and listening to calls, and the amount of tests that you listen to where there's just a wall of silence or a 3-minute interaction or engagement with the customer, it just strikes me as being a very, very large waste of time. And I think you made the point, Will, about end to end, and I think that is pretty imperative. I mean, what is an outcome? Well, it's sort of the result of an action or series of actions, or at least that's what Oxford English Dictionary told me when I looked at the definition earlier. So you don't know the result of a game of football until the final whistle is blown, and equally, you don't know if a customer has received a good outcome, from a mortgage sale or a journey or a collections journey or an insurance claims handling journey, unless you've looked across the end-to-end interactions and engagement that the customer's been through across that journey and what the end result of it was.
Point number two on this slide, Adrian, customer centric here. And it's worth stressing, which you've started off this conversation in this webinar, is that people are just as important as numbers. So you've got your MI, you've got your data points, but people will go hand in hand with that MI and data, and you're not going to get towards customer centricity or that customer centric culture without the role of people there.
Yeah, we were debating this. I mean, this, I guess, is your chance to throw me under the bus, as to whether or not we took the view that actually staff outcomes might trump consumer outcomes in this overall outcome testing view. So how many people genuinely are, I'm not going to say interested, how many people are genuinely tracking that the competence, capability of those individuals who are then themselves charged with ensuring that customers get good outcomes? Yeah, I think we sometimes forget, and let's put to one side those firms who are going to start in the chat saying, "Oh, we only deal digitally." So just for most of us, that point of truth, the moment of truth, is when the employee has some sort of interaction. What are you doing to make sure that employee is able to do so? We see attrition rising in the sector. One of the primary drivers is employees putting a hand up saying, "I can't do this anymore. Can't do this. I'd rather go and deliver Amazon parcels." Yeah, listen to my music and do that without having the stress and strain and lack of support. We hear this a lot, lack of support. And they don't mean somebody giving them a massage at the end of the day or whatever. It means giving me the tools and support to do this job to my best ability.
And the regulators being consistent. Sorry, go on, Mark.
Philip, there's been a great question published around the extent to which outcome testing and MI, how far do you need to go in terms of segmenting that for different customer types? Are we going to get a chance to respond to questions in writing? That's quite complicated, and it very much depends on the specific firm, products, and sorts of customers that they're dealing with. If we're going to get, sometimes we can respond to questions in writing post call. I might do that then, because it's quite a complicated response. But all I would say for the whole audience is just make sure you've got your vulnerable customers covered. As long as you've got that, then you've got a base starting position that you can have a reasonable conversation with the regulator about. If you start taking it beyond that, it gets very complicated, and I'll share a few thoughts and perspectives in writing after the call when I've got a bit more time.
We do
just remember, a load of your staff are vulnerable as well.
Yes.
So you've got vulnerable staff serving vulnerable customers. What are you doing to help the vulnerable staff?
Yeah, and we go into segmentation, size of your outcome testing as well in a couple of slides there. So we'll pick up on that point. Good point made in the chat there. But there's history here with the regulator, isn't there, Mark? And it seems like it's a never-ending story when it comes to outcome testing.
There's been a lot of focus on it recently. As a compliance consultant, I regularly get challenged about why we need to do this, and quite often as a consultant, I actually have to consult the rules, which I don't tend to like to do very much at all, if I'm brutally honest. But there is a specific rule actually, which does require, places a general requirement on firms to monitor the outcomes that their customers are receiving. So we've got a rule. I've already given the quote from that thematic that the FCA did of outcome testing in large insurance firms. I'm sure I don't need to repeat that. If we look at some examples of thematic review reports that have been issued just this year, retirement income advice, vulnerable customers, customer support outcomes, all of them quote a robust outcome testing framework as being an example of good practice, and on the flip side, not having an outcome testing framework as an example of bad practice. And even though the FCA is stepping back a little bit, if we look at some of the more recent surveys and information requests that have gone out to businesses sustainable lending, household claims, suitability of mortgage advice. All of those have questions which basically say, tell us about your outcome testing arrangements in this area. Tell us the results of the outcome testing that you've undertaken, and most importantly, tell us about the changes that you've made in response to any of the issues that you've identified. Which sort of takes us back to the previous slide about what good outcome testing is. You've got to make sure that it drives some action.
So how do you build this framework? And yeah, we're all into practicalities and outcomes on this webinar there. And Mark, talk us through where you think it starts in terms of actually building something that's fit for purpose and also stands up to regulatory scrutiny.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I mean, it fairly simply just starts with the definitions of what good outcomes are and what they aren't. And if we reflect on the way that businesses went about their consumer duty projects, there was quite a few across the market that realized that taking the time to exercise some thought and define what good outcomes meant for them, given their products, customer demographic, distribution channels, communication channels, so on and so forth. But unfortunately, there were other businesses that ran off and did consumer duty without necessarily doing that. I think with the passing of time, it's become clearer and clearer and clearer from the FCA that they do expect a degree of granularity in and around what good outcomes are and what they aren't. Again, quoted as good, or on the flip side, bad practices in a load of reports that participants in this webinar will have read. So that is absolutely key and critical, because it helps target and focus what we need to test and check.
Will, do you want to build on that and pick out a couple of other points?
I mean, just talking about the customer outcomes, I think you just need to bear in mind that you can have different profiles of customers as well. So, it's not as simple as one good outcome versus one bad outcome. You've got vulnerable customers in your target market, you've got different customers with different needs, and they're all going to have, a different outcome. So to build your framework, you need to understand those customer profiles, and the people who are doing, there's MI that feeds into it, but then there's the physical looking at the accounts as well. So if you're building your framework, the people that are looking at the accounts need to, have empathy with what those outcomes are, have empathy for the customers with different profiles, and, have like the skill set and power to make an objective judgment on a customer situation and how the way they've been treated. And then from an MI perspective, there's all kinds of things you need to look at, but qualitative and quantitative MI is going to be really important. So qualitative MI could be numbers of complaints, numbers of vulnerabilities, numbers of declines, numbers of customer refunds, an endless list really. And then quantitative MI could be feedback from customers, from surveys, staff feedback, that kind of stuff. And you need to be able to look at the two different sets of data and join the dots, see where there's linkages between qualitative and quantitative. So it's not an easy exercise.
Yeah. Life isn't easy, by the way, Will.
No.
So if you could, as audience members, I just wonder where you feel there's a roadblock or a stumbling block within designing an outcome testing framework. If you think it's defining what good and poor outcomes look like, put a 1 in the chat. If it's customer journeys, put 2, etc., etc. If it's identifying relevant data sources or MI, put 4 in the chat. Just wanted to know where you are thinking as well. Adrian, once the audience populates that in the chat, establishing testing methods. We talked about establishing methods and approaches, customer feedback, call, listening in, etc., etc. And point number 5, but also getting staff feedback as well, but empowering your staff to give, so that they feel that they've got permission to give the feedback in the first place without being criticized or judged as well, when a product or service may not be meeting the expectations of the customer.
Wow. So I think that is a lot of questions there, Philip. I think it comes to, the easy answer is culture, isn't it? If you've got an inappropriate culture, you are not going to be encouraging your staff to speak up. you've got the right culture, and you've not just done a tick box exercise as far as your staff training and competence is concerned, and if you're genuinely supporting them, you want your staff to speak up, because actually they're probably a unique insight into what's actually going on with your customers. It's a beautiful data source if you can harvest it. And we were talking earlier about the use of use of AI in some of these sorts of practices, take over from staff and things like that. Well, good luck with that, because the number one failing for artificial intelligence deployments is lack of or inappropriate data sources. So I would argue if you've already got the data, you don't need to ask the question. But anyway, I think that if you've got the right culture, your staff, and have the support and appropriate training, they will be an amazing source of insight on good customer outcomes, or where you're failing, more importantly.
Yeah, and if I look at the answers, I'm trying to track through them. Thank you very much for your responses, by the way. I think it's 4 and 1. So defining what good and poor outcomes look like, going back to your point, Mark, and IDing data sources and MI. We'll struggle with that still, Mark. I'm not. Why? Why is that the case?
So I just think, for me personally, I do think that time is a real issue here, and then also just limitations in terms of tech and system infrastructure, so on and so forth. What is relevant MI for testing outcomes? Well, firstly, you need to think about what those outcomes are, which requires a bit of intellectual thought, and nobody really has time to do that properly, do they? Secondly, we've talked about the need to, once the outcomes have been defined, map the journeys and figure out where the key pinch points and pain are, and therefore what you need to sort of check and test across those journeys. Again, that takes a little bit of time. And then it comes to what's actually relevant for testing and demonstrating that. And recourse is usually to look at the MI that you've got currently. And usually the MI that you've got currently is driven, by what your current systems, your current tech stack is actually capable of delivering. And if you take those stages and form the view that, well, we need to measure this, we don't have it currently because our systems are incapable of producing it. What do we need to do to fix that? And then that gets you into a world of pain as well. So I think the point I'm trying to make, Philip, is that there are a number of interlinking things, whether it be the thought processes, the time it takes to do those, the challenge with figuring out what's relevant when your first recourse is just to look at the data that you've got currently, and then actually addressing any shortfalls in that data, because it necessitates changes to processes, controls, systems themselves. It all just becomes quite a big exercise, and quite often the view is taken that just feels like far too hard work. But that's just my personal perspective.
And yet, yes, I know it probably sits in the too difficult box, but there's accountability, isn't there, Will? Point number 8 here, on oversight and governance, that senior managers on this call will be kind of like thinking, well, yes, it is difficult. Yes, it's it's time consuming and probably costly, but there's still accountability.
Yeah, I think in terms of second line challenge, it's difficult, especially in something that's growing and evolving as it is at the moment, because outcome testing is quite a new concept. In a lot of smaller firms, first and second, the lines between first and second line are quite blurred anyway. So I think as people go through these exercises and develop their framework, they've probably just got to accept the fact that first and second line are going to be blurred. But that doesn't mean first line should step away from it, from any sense of the imagination. But I think in an ideal world, you want first line doing a lot of routine, a lot of flexible outcome testing, and then second line should be going through the same process, seeing if they're reaching the same conclusions through looking at their MI, but also playing around with ideas, see if there's other things that they've identified that they should be looking at, and using a different methodology, and then moving away from this traditional first and second line being the fun police, and just realizing that you're all trying to monitor customer outcomes at the end of the day. which is honestly a challenge that I see in a lot of businesses. And I think they're going to get to the right place. I think they need to try and get that out of their head a little bit.
I've never heard them called the fun police before, but yeah, maybe that's a job title. Is that an SMF function holder title?
Yeah, SMF 16.
Philip,
Yeah.
I'm conscious you've moved on,
Yeah.
but really quickly on the previous slide, what I would urge participants is just to think about, you know, their risk appetite. So if we go through these 9 boxes, you can think, well, actually, this is a hell of a lot of work that we need to undertake. So there is always a prioritization piece. That prioritization should always be driven by your, you know, by your risk appetite. And you know, and let's take a holistic view. You know, we might have, you know, a couple of bits of MI. We might feel that we're, you know, we're short in a couple of areas of MI. We might do a couple of bits of relevant testing, but we might feel that we're a couple of bits of relevant testing short. The point I'm trying to make here is if you look at this quite holistically and you put those 2 bits of MI that you've got together, you put those 2 bits of testing that you're doing together to look at the specific thing that you're looking at, you might form the view based on your risk appetite that, you know, those 4 bits are enough. Those 4 bits give, you know, give me enough confidence that we are delivering the right outcomes in these areas, and therefore we don't need to worry about the 2 bits of MI that are missing. We don't need to worry about the 2 additional bits of testing and checking that, you know, we probably should have done, because, you know, the 4 bits that we do have based on our risk appetite probably gives us enough. And that is another really important thought process for, you know, for businesses to go through. Think holistically, think about everything that you can look to, and just make sure that you've got enough across those various sources to give you the level of comfort that you're delivering the right outcome.
So nice build, by the way, Mark. I like this segue into this particular table, traffic light systems. So MI to drive outcomes testing, MI to support outcomes testing, and the last, how to present outcomes testing. So building on your last point, Mark, how do firms use current MI to drive the objectives and the expectations that their board wants, as well as the regulator wants?
Yeah, and you know, and this is really important. So if you look at, I mean, I think we've listed a few examples on that particular page there. But if you look at your complaints root cause analysis MI, I mean, if it's done in the right way, you know, it can pinpoint products, stages of the product life cycle, or even specific interactions that present a higher risk and of unfair outcomes, and therefore could be subject to some targeted outcome testing. You know, if we look at things like arrears rates and the timescales within which customers go into arrears, that can help pinpoint loan types or customer types or even affordability assessment types that might warrant a closer look from an outcome testing perspective, also as something's clearly going wrong. You know, we've mentioned product cancellation or switching rates. You know, they can indicate challenges with product design, product sales processes, or even how easy a customer can just set up and use these products, all of which can inform where you might go and take a closer look from you know, from an outcome testing perspective, which plays directly into point 4. It just facilitates proactive and early intervention to figure out what's going on and what might need to be fixed.
And in the supporting stage, Will?
Yeah, I mean, just building on Mark's point in terms of the different types of MI, I think comprehensive data sources is key. So I think too often you see firms relying on the obvious data sources, which are fine. So QA results, upheld versus rejected complaints, you know, sales figures, Trustpilot reviews, they're all good. But I think a lot of the time they might paint the wrong picture and say, oh yeah, we're delivering good outcomes because we've got good Trustpilot reviews. So, you know, if you've got digital products, think about what data you can get from there through the application process. Is there chat bot data? Is there, you know, people with, you can do click rate, look at click rates, look at, you know, responses to financial promotions, payment behaviors, that kind of thing. But then I think the most important thing out of this middle column for me is the integrity of your data, because the FCA, you know, they keep harping on about the fact they're becoming a data-led regulator, and you know they're asking for more and bigger requests of data off firms. So you look at the PSD reporting that's just coming in at the moment. That's a lot of information that firms have not had to pull together and submit before. So just remember that all this data is probably going to end up in the hands of the regulator as well. So make sure you've got internal scrutiny and oversight process to make sure it's quality data if you're forming opinions on your outcomes.
Adrian, you often joke that senior managers know more about their photocopier than they do about their staff competency and capabilities. I think the insights into your people will be critical so that you present a clean pair of heels to the regulator, not only for your annual board report, but also to actually make sure that you're achieving daily good customer outcomes.
You know, I think not necessarily willfully or deliberately, but I think most firms are measuring the wrong outcome when it comes to their employees. So no pun intended, but they're measuring the completion of an event. Adrian's been trained. Tick. Therefore, we can move on. So the exec will be receiving, doubtless, a sea of green, to Will's point earlier, saying, we've done this. Everyone knows what they're doing. Unfortunately, you're measuring the wrong thing. You're measuring the completion of events. What you should be measuring is the outcome of that event, which should be competent employee, competent, capable, happy, willing. That's what you should be measuring. And if you're measuring that, you can put that in your board pack. That's very much more credible than a sea of green. We trained everybody. Well, how come we getting all this stuff wrong?
Nice build. I love it. Goodness me, you guys are on fire today. Well done. It's like we've rehearsed this as well.
Silly.
Okay, I spoke too soon. I'm there. So let's ask a question before we crack on to part 2 of this webinar. How effectively do the insights and findings from your firm's outcomes testing drive tangible improvements in customer outcomes? So how effectively do the insights and findings from your firm's outcome testings drive tangible improvements in customer outcomes? And this is important. Why? Because obviously board reports are shortly expected or shortly signed off. Mark, where are we, Will, with this? And where are firms tracking vis-a-vis last year's panic or race to the line?
Yeah, I think the key thing to look at here is the fact that last year a lot of firms were giving an opinion in their board reports as to how well they'd implemented the consumer duty, and I think it's important they don't carry on. I mean, the board report might have an element of that in it this year, but really they need to step away from that and start reporting on the actual outcomes this year, and you know what their outcome reporting is telling them, and you know what actions they are taking or they are going to be taking to improve, rather than how effectively they have implemented the duty.
And I think,
Mark, I mean, go.
No, you know, I was going to say, I agree in that point, but I also mentioned earlier that, you know, last year's board report was shortly after the implementation periods had closed. Many businesses were just finalizing builds of, you know, new processes, new controls, new frameworks, whatever terminology you want to describe. You know, and therefore there wasn't necessarily, you know, the outcome testing or the MI put in place in full at that point. Fast forward 12 months, you know, I would hope that we now have a lot more tangible information that we can use to make the consumer duty board reports look a lot more like they should be looking. We are getting to the deadline. I've seen a few templates from firms. They look like they're going more in the right direction. I'm looking forward over the next 2 or 3 weeks to see some completed versions, just to see whether the indicators that we were traveling in the right direction has actually led to us getting to the right destination.
Does this surprise you? I mean, limited effectiveness, 29% recording that not too sure whether the insights and findings from their outcome testing is actually driving better customer outcomes. Is that Is that what you're seeing?
I'm not surprised. Again, I think Philip, you used the term that some problems are just too difficult to deal with, and that that sometimes you sort of want to put your head in the sand. Businesses do have resourcing challenges. There's always an abundance of of conflicting priorities. So I'm not surprised that there isn't a higher score for acting on issues completely and fully effectively. We see all of the time in our line of work. The phrase I often give is that sometimes you're better off not to find something than what you are finding something and not doing anything about it. That really just doesn't go down well with the regulator at all.
So how do we go beyond? I'm seeing your body language, Adrian.
So the next step is find it and shove it under the carpet, Mark.
Well, no, because you found it. Better off not finding something. Full stop. So
don't go looking. Don't go looking.
My outcome testing framework is just work in progress. We'll start to do some proper testing in 3 years. Is probably a better answer than we've got a good framework. We've identified a load of bloody findings, but we don't have the resource or the money or can be bothered to fix them.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Wow, you woke up cynical this morning.
So,
well, but it comes back to your point about governance and governance and culture, Adrian. I think it is very difficult for a management team, to have a conversation with the FCA that basically says, yes, we've known about some material issues that are leading to unfair outcomes for our customers, but we've chosen to not fix them, or we've chosen to delay fixing them because we've prioritized other things. I mean, from a governance and culture perspective, that is a really, really challenging conversation for the executive to have with the regulators, and it doesn't typically end well.
I completely agree. And in my experience with a regulator, in a different sector, admittedly, I always found that being honest and accepting that we weren't perfect, but we were actively seeking the areas where we were weak, and we were doing our best to prioritize because we only have so much resource. The improvement of those activities always led to a very sensible conversation. We're taking action. It may not be at the pace that you want us to take action, but really the prioritization should be defined by the regulator anyway, by the Act. You all know that, and we're just not going as fast as we can.
And this goes to the heart of the FCA's reset supervisory approach. You'll have all read stuff which talks about the FCA being more proportionate, talks about it encourage growth, and it is trying to step back a little bit and develop a good working relationship with businesses, or it says it's trying to. But that is contingent on the business. That is contingent on them being able to trust businesses to find issues and to fix it, basically. So don't be surprised to hear more and more conversations in and using the word trust from a regulator perspective, and perhaps think about how that slightly different focus is, that more emphasis on trust, that more emphasis on you doing the right things in the right way and coming forward if you need to have a reflect on whether or not your current approach to dealing with the regulator needs a bit of revisiting in light of their new supervisory approach.
Before we move on from this slide, I want to pick up on fair value assessment. We've got a lot of feedback on fair value assessment in the chat, and there will talk us through perhaps MI that can reflect better outcomes when it comes down to this expectation.
I think.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, carry on.
No, you go. Well, it's fine. Sorry.
I think from a fair value assessment point of view, a lot of firms do a good fair value assessment at the beginning of the product, but what they don't do is continue that fair value assessment throughout the lifetime of the product. So, if you've got a product with various product features linked to it, there might be like a premium bank account, for example, where you get lots of bits and bobs added on to that product as you pay a monthly fee. a fair value assessment could continue to look at, the use of those features as your customer base is using those different features throughout the lifetime of the product. So that's all a good information that can feed as to whether you are actually delivering value for that customer, whether they're signed up for the products and services, and whether they're actually using them.
Okay.
And
then when we go on, Mark.
No, I was just going to say, again, we've just been reflecting on the FCA's revised supervisory approach. Some of you may have seen that they're rushing through all of the, the thematic work that they previously undertaken because they want to start with a flat, completely clean slate and, focus on, new topics, going forward. But in the interim, and whilst they're figuring all of that out, the focus on the adequacy of fair value assessments is one area that they're going to keep on looking at as earnestly as they have done in previous days. So it's just be mindful that it's always going to be that key area of focus.
Adrian, when you look at what good MI covers, you've always challenged firms to actually make sure that they don't have their sight or line of sight in the rear view mirror when it comes down to metrics and MI there. Tendency to collect that data because it's easier, as opposed to number 6 here, to be forward looking.
Yeah, listen, I've run some very big businesses. Forward lead indicators are scarce. Yeah, lag indicators, you've got them everywhere. Yeah, so you're almost drowning in rear view perspective. I would encourage every firm to be, and I'm sure all this preaching to the converted. I'm sure everyone recognises the value of those forward-facing indicators. They are hard to get, and in relation to your people, that your people do represent a very significant risk to your organisation in landing consistently good outcomes. You can't measure that. That would seem to be a really big Achilles heel. You should be able to measure it, and it should be able to highlight to you where future potholes lie on the road.
Will audience-specific MI as well? I mean, every business line will have different expectations, and so will seniority of the organisation, as well as obviously the regulators' expectations there. Audience-specific is critical.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a board, for example, it needs to be aggregated up to them, and it really needs to paint a picture as to what the customer is experiencing. So, I mean, I hate to use the term, but through the customer lens. I think something linked to that is that I've seen in a few organisations they have quite good information in the different management committees. Like you might have a credit risk committee talking about, application rates and accepts versus declines, or they might be talking about arrears rates. And in the compliance or operational committees, they're talking about conversations with customers about forbearance and arrears, and they'll also be talking about application quality or affordability. But there's obviously linkages between the two, but they're not actually joining the dots between those two committees and then painting a better picture. So I think that's important, just to be able to step back and look at what's happening in these different forums.
Talking about painting a different Banksy picture, Mark, how should the information be presented then?
Yeah, and I think this is an area that's often overlooked. Businesses just tend to focus on what the actual metrics are and the relevancy of them, and don't necessarily think about how they might be presented, to facilitate demonstrable use. So we've just provided a few hints and tips on here. Use of things like targets and tolerance levels, historical data to facilitate trend analysis over time, use of RAG or high, medium, and low ratings to draw a reader's attention to what's important. Balance of qualitative and quantitative data, so on and so forth. And I think from a consumer duty perspective, this presentational piece is going to be a real challenge, actually, because we're tending to see lots of businesses struggle with aggregation, actually. A granular level, well, a business sort of level, you might have really granular data on customer experience, customer outcomes, but then by the time that's combined with other business areas as it gets through to the the board of directors, all meaningful insights and conclusions have been lost. So yeah, really have a good think about the whole approach to aggregating the MI as it gets through the business, because it's a real challenge.
And Adrian, I don't think that we've been in a webinar, well, probably for the last 4 or 5 years since we've been doing these things, where we haven't spoken about culture. You can have systems, processes, solutions, all the Gucci kit to actually make sure that you produce your MI. But if that's not powered or underpinned by a positive, inclusive culture, then it's not going to work. It's not going to happen, is it?
No. Just quite simply, if the C-suite aren't genuinely bought into consumer duty, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. You're best will in the world, yeah, because it's going to get suppressed. People aren't stupid, right? Employees know, tone from the top, whatever you want to call it. I hear it a lot. I on these webinars and meeting lots of people, particularly in the compliance space, second line, saying, we're doing our best, but we're not given the support. We're not given the freedom to do what we think is right. Now that is a tone from the top blocker. That's a culture that's ultimately going to get exposed, because these are just ways of sense checking culture.
And there are ways of measuring and evaluating, and this is not once and done, as the regulator talks about culture being contagious, within an organization, and that can be contagious from a positive point of view, but also from a negative point of view. So organizations can't park the cultural question, can they? No. They've got to actually make sure that that behaviors are represented through what their staff say and what they do each and every day, and not just an employee sentiment survey at the end of the year.
Absolutely. I think what a good challenge is for people who are on the floor and on the telephone interacting with customers at different stages of journeys, do they actually really understand how their role impacts the outcome for that customer? Do they understand that? Does everyone understand that? And if they do, I think you're starting to get, at least a proportion of the way there.
So how do firms challenge themselves, Mark? And to follow good practice, but also challenge themselves. We've listed 8 questions on the right-hand side that would kind of prompt organizations to think differently or think deeper into how they could actually improve their approach to outcomes testing and outcomes monitoring there. Which one stood out for you?
I think you're going to accuse me as a consultant and sitting on the fence here, Philip, because I'm not going to give you a direct answer. I think the challenge with all of this, a robust outcomes testing framework, a robust outcomes MI framework, there are just so many different components that all need to interlink and engage effectively in order to make them work. There are certain things you need to do to make sure that it's timely, relevant, accurate, adds value. There are so many things that you need to do to ensure that the messages are presented and delivered in the right way, and it facilitates the meaningful debate, action, and challenge. And of course, as we previously debated, if there's issues in there that ain't leading to to actions and challenge, then it's all for naught basically. So I'm going to say that every single thing on that page, they're all of validity. They all need to be thought about, and they all need to, like I say, properly interlink and work together to deliver a good framework.
Okay, thanks for sitting on the fence there. Appreciate that. So somebody who never sits on the fence, Adrian. By the way,
yes, uncomfortable.
Put simply, are some firms' approach to training putting their business at risk?
Yes, of course. Yeah, and I think it's becoming increasingly uncomfortable. I think employees know it, management know it. Ticking boxes is still a default model. Let's face it, in this sector, it's still a default model. Yes, you are putting your business at risk. I keep talking about health and safety and what happened in the health and safety parallel, completely different to your market. But as soon as senior management and execs started getting sent to prison, boxes stopped getting ticked and people started working safely. And those practices of culture just changed. And now I'm happy to work some time in a dangerous working environment sector. The UK is super safe because that legislation drove genuine culture for safe working. It's not working in the UK financial services sector at this point in time because far too many firms tick a box, throw the staff under the bus. Yeah, I think consumer duty is a cornerstone piece of legislation that I hope will change financial services culture such that the consumer is genuinely put at the center of the radar and employees are given the help and support and tools they need to deliver great outcomes to customers.
And I know from firsthand by talking to many of your clients that they are waiting eager anticipation of the FCA visits so they can showcase employee competence. I was quite surprised.
I know that is yes, that was very heartwarming to hear that from one particular customer who said, "I can't wait for the visit," which is great. I was slightly nervous, but you're absolutely right. All of these firms have embraced an appropriate approach where they are gently and continually assessing competence, quantifying it, and fixing the gaps in a collaborative and gentle way, not a penal way.
And there is a different approach, and the regulators talk about this is not just a spin by Elephants Don't Forget on this, but they've talked about role-specific training, scenario-based learning, especially around vulnerable customers, and also who is involved in that training. They highlighted a lack of leadership involved in vulnerability training as well, and also product service design teams as well involved. So it's who you're training as well as how you're training there, which is a critical difference.
It is. Now, listen, in our world where we have senior execs, it's almost like it's after shutting the door after the horse was bolted type thing. But senior execs, when they themselves engage with Nelly and see their levels of competence and the gap, they're very, very grateful that Nelly is helping them solve that problem. But they've got to go through there. And I wonder if you put all execs in the financial services space through that, whether or not that would be an accelerant to changing culture in the sector. If they could see for themselves the level of lack of competence across their employees, I suspect that might drive some different behaviours.
Look, we've covered a lot, Will and Mark, in this webinar. There's an opportunity to reach out to yourselves at Avyse and to make sure that you can enhance your firm's approach to consumer duty compliance, supporting with outcome testing framework, kicking the tires on that, building and uplifting your board report and MI around your approach to consumer duty. The opportunity to click and indicate your interest in obviously moving away using Clever Nelly from a one-size-fits-all approach to TNC, eradicating what Adrian called that box-ticking approach to culture to drive improvements in consumer duty. Also an opportunity to sign up to papers, blogs from our respective organisations on the topics that matter to you most on this there. Wrap us up, Will and Mark, with what needs to be done, next steps. Yes, we'll be giving you the webinar recording alongside the PDF of the slides, but how do firms take practically what you've all shared and put that into action straight away?
Well, I mean, I think you always need a driver for something, don't you? And you need a driver for something that you can believe in. And I sort of feel that, lots of businesses spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money in some instances trying to get their consumer duty projects right. And, therefore, to my mind, it logically follows that, that you want to have some testing, you want to have MI that shows that all of that time, all of that investment, all of that money was absolutely worth it. And, and to figure out where, these additional processes, these additional controls that you put in place are going right. But most importantly, equally importantly, where they're going wrong and can be lost. So I think there's real value in businesses getting this the outcome testing, the MI right, not just simply because this is where the FCA is focusing on at this particular minute in time, and will inevitably ask for some evidence of what you've done and not done.
Philip, can I just address that last? Can I finish on that last point where someone's making the point about AI displacing or effectively reducing the need for people? Well, I've been in business for 40 years, and during that time, I've seen about 10 major pieces of technology come into the marketplace to make us more efficient. During that 40 years, the number of people employed in the UK has gone up by 35%. The demise of the human in the workplace is massively overrated. So I get your point, but let's look at history. Industrial Revolution, employment went up 300%, right? So technology has its place. Will it displace people from the financial services sector? Quite candidly, don't be ridiculous. It is a people-based business.
For more on the fence judgments and assessments there, dial into next month's webinar. I'm there. Look, Will, what haven't we spoken about that we really need to talk about?
I think we've covered a good breadth of it. I think just the messages I'd like to relay are define your outcomes, define your MI to measure those outcomes, and just remember that outcome testing isn't call listening. So
yeah. Okay. On that note, thank you very much for your time. Look, we will take a number of questions offline. I know that you've been inundating us, which is great. It is fantastic. We are going to not use AI to answer those questions. We're going to single-handedly, humanly respond to those questions as well. Yes, PDF version of the slides will be made available to you straight after the webinar alongside a recording of this webinar. Hope to see you all soon. Take care. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.